All right, I reckon we're ready. 3 John. All 14 verses of it. All right, so 3 John is the shortest epistle in the Bible. It is a personal letter to a man named Gaius, which is not unique among the epistles either. Paul's epistle to Philemon was also a personal letter to a guy named Philemon. So this is a personal letter to a guy named Gaius, but it's a personal letter with the intent that it's going to be read to the whole congregation. You'll understand why as we go through it. Gaius, the guy it's written to, was probably a member of this congregation to which John is writing, involved layman in the congregation. And the purpose of the letter is to address a problem in the church, and particularly a power grab by one of the members of the congregation, which is, revealing. We tend to think that New Testament era with the disciples around was kind of the golden age of Christianity when, there was peace and harmony and the church grew and all of that. There wasn't ever a period of peace and harmony. Even right from the beginning, even while the disciples are still alive, there's a great deal of conflict in some of these congregations. And this one, when you read this letter, it's the kind of conflict in a congregation that destroys a congregation. So, verse 1. To the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Again, our English, it's a shame in John's epistles. The English just doesn't do justice. For instance, the word elder, the elder. Again, we noted this in the previous letter, second epistle to John. The word elder is the Greek word presbyteros, which is the word presbyter. So this is more than just some old guy, an elder. It is the pastor, the presbyter. John refers to himself as kind of like, I'm the main pastor. So the pastor to this Gaius guy. It's John in a way pulling his credentials. I'm not just writing to you as a friend. I'm not just writing to you as John. I'm the pastor. So it's more of an office thing when it says the elder. A lot of folks think elder is the equivalent of our kind of New Testament office of elder. Completely different thing. This elder in the Greek is pastor, presbyter. So John emphasizes twice in this first verse the idea of love. My beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. He's really kind of slathering it on in a way because this is going to be a tough letter. And it's addressing a pretty tough thing. And John wants to be clear that this is done in love. So it's a beloved Gaius whom he loves. Twice he uses the word love, and he'll use beloved to start off the next verse too. Now, it's a letter, as I said, to a congregation, but to a specific man in the congregation. A question on the handout. What would the effect be in the congregation if John writes to a specific man and emphasizes his Christian pastoral love for him? So, knowing this letter is going to be read to the congregation, and I'll show you a bit why we know that, he starts off addressing only Gaius and says, my beloved Gaius, whom I truly love. What's the effect of that going to be to the congregation? Some in the congregation, as we'll see, might be jealous about that. Yeah. It's it's setting up this Gaius guy. It's holding him up as the example in the congregation. It's kind of signaling to the congregation, this is the guy you should be looking at. You know, this is a guy you can trust. This is a guy who has my imprimatur. So he's a good guy. He's a trustworthy guy. I respect him. I love him. Look to him. So it's holding this Gaius up to the congregation, setting him up as really the example in the congregation. And yeah, for some people who are petty, that's going to create jealousy. For other people who are maybe in the middle someplace, that's going to signal to them, this is the guy you want to watch. Verse 2. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers. Again, calls the guy a loved one. He really stresses the fact that Gaius is loved by him. That you may prosper in all things, the Greek literally, that in all things you are well. Verse 3. For I rejoice greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. Brethren came. Probably members of this congregation, or at least another option is it could possibly be, they had like traveling teachers. You know, back in the history of the Missouri Synod, we had something similar called a circuit rider, where one pastor was basically in charge of about 10 congregations. And he made this huge visit, this loop on the back of a horse that took him several weeks to complete. We don't have that so much more anymore, but they did back then have sort of like traveling teachers. These were Christian pastors whose job it was to essentially unify the church and go from church to church and teach the truth. And, kind of like an ongoing catechism class to the different churches to make sure they were all on the same page, same doctrine. And they traveled around, and then they were hosted by a congregation when they came to their congregation. So it could also be these brethren is this group that had visited this congregation, and now they're coming back to John. They're sort of like sent out by John. They're John trained by John to kind of be his mouthpiece and his ears out in these different congregations as they're catechizing. So they come back to John, they report to John, hey, this Gaius guy is doing a good job. You know, he's solid doctrinally. He's a good leader in the congregation. So John, again, emphasizes the fact that this Gaius guy has a reputation even among these itinerant teachers and preachers. Again, signaling to the congregation, this is a good guy. Testified of the truth that's in you as you walk in the truth. So Gaius is a guy who has the truth. 4, I have no greater joy than to hear my children walk in truth. Yet another way John is sort of lavishing on this Gaius guy praise. My children, calling Gaius my child. That he's filling John's joy up by being truthful and doctrinally sound. Now on the handout again, little asterisk there under verse 4. Consider the great affection of John's letter. He makes sure they understand that everything he's about to say is said in love and concern as a father for his children. Even calls Gaius my child. My children walk in the truth. And everybody else like Gaius in that congregation who's faithful. There's no animosity or knee-jerk anger in his words. You know, it's a good lesson for how to approach a difficult situation. Preface your words in love, keep your cool, but be firm. And that's exactly what John does. Everything is prefaced so much in love. Just love over and over and over again in these first 5 verses. So yeah, if you have conflict to deal with, this is a good way to do it. Make sure love is the groundwork of it, and you firmly establish it in love before you proceed to the conflict part.
The other thing, of course, that he's stressing his truth is in that 3 times.
Yes. Exactly. Truth is in there 3 times. The thing he's going to be confronting in this letter is a lack of truth in a guy. So again, he's laying the groundwork for, you need to be grounded in doctrine, not in personalities, basically. Be grounded in truth.
Your word is truth.
Yes, and in the word then, that absolutely establishes the truth. Verse 5, beloved, there it is again. You do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers. Not a great translation. The literal Greek in verse 5 on the handout is, beloved, you do the faith when you work for the brethren and the strangers. Not you do faithfully. And this is another typical Johannine thing that we've seen in the other epistles. When John talks about faith, it's always doing it. You do the faith. Faith is not mental apprehension. Faith is not believing a system of principles. It's not new ideas. For John, it's always you do the faith. Faith is action. What you confess, so you practice. It's all one and the same. And if it's not that, if faith is not that, then you misunderstand the nature of faith. Faith is action. Faith is confession. What we speak, we do. And so John, in his language, communicates that very effectively. You do the faith. And the way they were doing the faith here in verse 5 is they were hosting and being kind to these brethren and these strangers. Now, brethren and strangers may be the same thing, or it may be different things. It's hard to tell. Because these itinerant preachers, these brethren that went out from the apostles to teach and to unify the congregation around catechesis, they were strangers to these congregations. So when they welcomed them in, they were welcoming in complete strangers until they got to know everybody, and then they weren't strangers anymore. So it may be the same group, or it may be other Christians visiting from other places, and they are strangers. So you do faithfully when you take care of these people. Verse 6. You have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well. Now it's their love that's the focus. Love is still on the table. You bear witness of your love before the church by taking care of these people. So on the handout, this shows that those who have been helped told others of the kindness shown them. Faith and charity went together, and the early witness of the Christian faith pointed to the charity and love expressed by Christians. Again, Christianity was not a set of principles to be verbally accepted or mentally apprehended, but active Christ-like love. Consider Jesus' own ministry. Teaching and healing went together. Jesus never just taught. He taught and he healed, or he taught and he fed, or he taught and provided wine. Jesus always taught and did charitable things in the process to show that the faith he was teaching was real. It was grounded in reality. It wasn't just mental principles, again. It was supposed to change your life. And these early Christians demonstrate this. They showed their love by doing for these people. And again, this is a good lesson for us. We live in a world of talk. We Christians shouldn't be about talk. We should be action. If we see somebody in need, we help them. We're going to have, I've got it in the bulletin this week, we're going to have in 2 weeks, Pastor Spratt will be here talking about the Alaska mission. And we are helping him, thankfully. We've got it in the church budget to help him with several $1,000s a year. And there's other money that comes in besides that. 2 weeks after him, July 7th, there'll be a missionary from Taiwan here. And he's the guy who led me around Taiwan. He's a big white guy who speaks better Chinese than most Chinese. And the Chinese told me that, in fact. That's not me guessing. I had several of the Taiwanese tell me his Mandarin is better than most native Chinese. So he is exceptionally good at his language. But, you know, God put him where he's at for a reason. He's a great communicator and everything. But he'll be here with us then July 7th. And I'd like to have a special offering for him after church. But this is the kind of stuff that as Christians here in the middle of Iowa, we can have a worldwide impact by helping these men who are actually out there on the front lines in these countries. Yeah, and I don't know if you heard, they invited me to Taiwan a few months ago to talk about the same-sex marriage thing because they put a public referendum. What does the public feel about same-sex marriage? It was like 70% after I left. The referendum was the week after I was there. After I left, 70% of the public said they're against same-sex marriage. So just like in the United States, the courts take it into their own hands, and either last week or week before, the courts legalized same-sex marriage in Taiwan, even though 70% of the population says they're against it. And this missionary who's coming says the only reason they're doing that is because Taiwan is trying to be like America. They see the U.S. and they want to copy us. They think we're heaven on earth. So even their court systems copy our court systems' insanity. So at any rate, these people need our support. And as John praises this congregation for its ongoing support of these men who are out there catechizing and doing the work of the church, you know, we should take that in and know we've got the same opportunities here. All right, verse 7. Oh, first of all, before we leave 6, if you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, what does that mean? Sending them forward in their journey in a manner worthy of God. Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Possibly a call.
In the sense of what?
Well, you're not going to preach unless you have a proper call.
Okay. So saying that they called these men? Is that what you're suggesting, or what?
Calling as a missionary or
Okay.
something along that lines.
How come if is in italics?
Because it's not in the original Greek. That's an English interjection, addition to the text. The text literally reads in the Greek, you send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. Then you do well. For the sake of making the language sound better, it's if you send them forward.
In other words, their performance would be by the approval of God.
That could be another way of seeing it. That God, yes, that this being charitable and loving towards them and sending them out is to the approval of God. That's what God wants them to do, absolutely. And it shows forth God's love. I mean, it's Christ-like love to care for others actually and not just wish them well and send them on their way. So it's tied up in their faith doing this in some way. It's an expression of truth in Christ in their actions. All right, now 7. Because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. They, again, are these brethren that they are taking care of when they come through. They went forth for his name's sake. They were doing God's work. And they're going around catechizing, being the disciples, eyes and ears and mouth, serving God. This is their call, in a way.
So doesn't verse 7 explain verse 6?
It does in a big way, yep.
So what they may be talking about doing is, since they're going among the Gentiles and they don't want to take anything from the Gentiles, they send them off with enough sustenance to get them through to the next place they go to.
And that works too, yes. They're taking care of them and supplying their needs along the whole way, not making them have to rely on the Gentiles. But why the Gentiles? Let's discuss that a minute here too. Why is it important they don't rely on the Gentiles? First of all, who are the Gentiles? Because the irony is, all of these names he names in this epistle are all Gentile names. Gaius is a Greek name. He's going to mention Demetrius, Greek name. Diotrephes, Greek name. All those names that are going to come up in this epistle are all Gentile names. So John is using the word Gentile not so much to mean non-Jew as he is to mean unbeliever, basically. The people outside the church. So it's just a different sense that he's using the word here. So Gentile, unbeliever. Why is it important that these traveling teachers don't have to rely on the unbelievers for their support? Yeah, it could be practical. They're just not going to get the support because they're not on the same page as the unbelievers. I think it's more than that, though, too.
I start thinking that the only reason they're there is for the food or sustenance or whatever.
Yeah, the part of the message that early Christianity is teaching is that God provides. You know, you can let go of your idolatry, you can let go of your unbelief, God's going to provide. And if these traveling teachers have to go around from town to town begging, basically, looking for handouts from unbelievers, then the witness could very well be that God is not supplying, and you've got to turn to the unbelieving world to supply your needs. So by the Christians supplying their needs, they're sending the message that God is going to take care of you. God is supplying. And we don't need the unbelieving world to meet our needs. This is actually one of the reasons why I have resisted like doing fundraisers for the youth group and such as community projects, you know, putting out a food stand someplace to get money to help from the community. Because I don't think it's the community's responsibility to be supporting the youth group. It's the church's responsibility. So I anyway, have resisted that, using the Gentiles for anything. And I was invited a few years ago at one of the Hubbard Day things. It's been a while now. They don't invite me to things anymore. But at the time, they invited us as a congregation to take part in a community-wide white elephant sale they were going to do at the park. And I said, I'm not comfortable with selling things to the community to get money for the church, but if you want, I said we could talk about a white elephant giveaway. I'm fine with doing charity work and giving things to people. That wasn't of interest, so there was nothing like that. But I don't want to use the community as our fundraising basis, because it's not up to the Gentiles to support the work of Christ. It's our responsibility as Christians to support the work of the gospel. And we give, we don't take, which is also part of the kind of subtle message of the gospel. God does all the giving. He doesn't take from us. He gives and then receives back to himself the very thing he gives us. So it's all kind of tied up to the very substance of the gospel itself. They're embodying the gospel as they go out there. So they're not taking from the community, they're giving. And the church supports that. Paul had the same thing too. Paul in Acts talks about how he meets his own needs as he works along the way with his hands. He doesn't rely on handouts. So, all right, taking nothing from the Gentiles. There's a purpose for that. 8, we therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. There's the truth thing again. So the love and the truth he keeps hitting over and over again. And why do we support these people? Because that's how we take part in their work. They're the mouthpiece, but we can be the bankroll behind them to get them there. Or we can be the support, and our prayers can uphold them. And we can participate with this. It's not everybody gets to go out and do this, but everybody does get to support it and work for it. Verse 9. I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Now he finally gets to the problem. Everything from verse 1 to verse 8 is all a setup to address this problem. He's focusing them on love, he's focusing them on truth and charity and the gospel, and now bang, verse 9, this is where it's going wrong. Loves to have the preeminence. This guy named Diotrephes loves to have the preeminence. In the Greek, literally, it's one word. Loves to have preeminence in English is one word in the Greek. That literally means he loves to be first. It's the two words, the word for love and the word for first. So he loves being first. So here's a guy who likes being the center of attention. Loves to be first.
So is this the reason why John is writing to Gaius instead of to the church?
Exactly. Because this Diotrephes guy is kind of like, he's one of two things. He's either a layman who's gotten too big for his britches and thinks he runs the church, or, and that's probably the case, I think, or he could be like even a pastor who was appointed who's now running rampant and thinking he runs this thing and he's no longer a servant of Christ. I think he's probably a layman who has just gotten too big for his britches. And that is exactly why John is writing Gaius. Because if he wrote the church, this Diotrephes guy would intercept the letter and the church would never hear it. So he's going through Gaius, knowing Gaius is going to take the letter to the church and deal with the problem then. So yeah, it's a tactical move to go through Gaius, not write the church directly, because this Diotrephes guy is trouble. Loves to have preeminence among them. You still see this in some congregations. I'm thankful we don't have issues like that here. But there are some congregations where you've just got somebody who thinks he runs it. And he's just a bully. And sometimes it's even the pastor. He's just a bully. He just pushes people around to get what he wants. Isn't so much concerned with truth and love as he is concerned with his position in the community and his job. It happens. In fact, part of Paul's instruction in choosing ministers, pastors, is that they shouldn't be a novice in the faith lest they become puffed up. When I first was ordained, my home congregation back in Ripon, there was a member there who was, I'd consider her liberal. I think that's a fair assessment. But anyway, when I was ordained, she came up to me in church the next time I visited my home congregation, and she said, so what's it feel like now to be the guy in charge? You really don't understand anything about the ministry if you think that now that you're a pastor, you're the guy in charge. You know, it really goes to show how a person can completely misunderstand the ministry. That's not it. An office of service should not be seen as an office of power, which is how some people do see it. Why I hate politics in the church so much. It shouldn't be about who's first, who's got the power. For this Diotrephes guy, that's all it was. It was a power trip. And we've still got that stuff going on in the church. So, yeah, all right. So this is the problem. This is the guy. Now here's another question. Is Paul in a way sinning against John, is John in a way sinning against the 8th commandment by calling this guy out publicly evidently without first talking to him face to face? Doesn't Matthew say something about if you have a problem with your brother, go see him face to face? Why isn't John sinning against the 8th commandment here? And it's a very public thing, too. This man is publicly denying the gospel by his actions. It's not, as you say, a personal thing between him and John. Exactly right. And it is destroying this whole congregation. The simple mechanics of the age would mean John can't very well Skype the congregation or call them up or just hop in the car and go and visit. This is the only means of dealing with this. And a letter, sending a letter to somebody would take weeks. Somebody has to personally carry it to the person. So the way of having to address this stuff, this is the only way he could address it. And it couldn't wait. He had to deal with it now because it was damaging the congregation. And it was a public sin, and as such would demand public reproval.
And I would say it's probably pretty obvious that somebody else probably has already talked to him on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, no doubt.
The two or three to bring along.
Could be.
To the church. Maybe they had gone through the steps. We don't know.
Or this Gaius fellow, who's the guy of the truth.
Right.
Undoubtedly, he stood against this Diotrephes fellow.
Right, so maybe he was the original person who had contacted him, talked to him about it, and then they went to the church and there's still nothing would happen, so they brought in John.
That's, in fact, probably the most likely scenario. Absolutely. Yeah. So John calls the guy out. Verse 10. The other problem, besides the preeminence, he does not receive us. So he's trying to keep John out of it. He doesn't want them to come into the congregation. Why? Because they're going to set things straight and he's going to look bad. Verse 10, therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. So there's a real bully at work. John threatens to call to mind, literally remember. He's going to rehearse all of his deeds in public and call this guy out in public when he comes. He doesn't receive them, those itinerant preachers or visiting Christians. And John really groups himself with those itinerant preachers. That is, he doesn't receive us in verse 9. He prats against us. John is including himself in that us. We're the people he's fighting against because those itinerant preachers were John's mouthpiece. They were John in John's absence. With malicious words, the Greek word there literally means things that make no sense, nonsense, disparaging remarks, gossip. He's just making stories up to run them down in public. So, another nothing has changed over the years sort of thing. If you can't beat the guy on his doctrine, destroy his reputation as a human being. It's still the same tactic used in churches. Sad to say.
And in politics.
And in politics, that's right. Destroy the other person's character and you'll win the argument. You don't even have to address the argument if you can just destroy the other person's character. So exactly the same thing that we have in our day, John personally had to deal with as somebody was trying to destroy his character. I mean, the gall of going after John of all people, the last living apostle, the one who was, the most tender-hearted, the one who spends the most time talking about love and compassion, who was an elderly man at this point in time, and you go after him and start talking bad about him? I mean, what a dirtball to go after a guy like John. He's like the last apostle. If anybody deserved the utmost honor and respect at that point in history, anywhere in Christendom, it was John. And this guy goes after him. And worse, it just keeps snowballing. Not only does he personally refuse to host these itinerant preachers, he won't let anybody else in the congregation do it either. And even, it implies one of two things here at the end, when it says, puts them out of the church. He either is excommunicating the people who try and host these brethren, or he's just plain pushing the itinerant preachers when they come to do catechesis, just pushing them out the door and saying, get out of here. It's one of the two. But either way, what a vile thing to do. He's totally abusing his power, which is why, I think he may have been kind of not lay preacher, but he might have been kind of appointed to be one of the heads of the church there and acting as a pastor. But he's totally abusing his office by his behavior if that was the case. So, handout here, this man sins against the 8th commandment, that is, he lies. He also fails to show Christ-like love by refusing to host the brethren. Yeah, and why refuse to host them? Because they're going to expose him. They're going to teach contrary to what he's teaching. They're going to make him look bad. So he's just protecting himself. More than that, he won't let others host him. More than that, he abuses excommunication. So, just stop and think. The last question there. What's the atmosphere within this congregation? What would it like to be a member there? If you had a guy like that in this congregation, I announced we're going to have visiting missionaries, and he goes out of his way to start bad-mouthing them within the congregation, telling everybody how evil they are, how bad they are, refuses to let anybody host them, kicks them out of the church when they show up, shows them the door, tells them to get out of here. What would the atmosphere be like in that congregation? Miserable. Awful. The sheep terrorized by this pseudo-shepherd. This really would have been a horrible congregation to be a member of. And this guy single-handedly was creating this atmosphere of hostility and suspicion and maliciousness. This was a very troubled congregation. And believe me, they're still out there. Verse 11. May you not get one, by the way, Jason, when you... Verse 11. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. Again, without naming him by name, John is just plain calling this Diotrephes guy evil. Don't imitate what's evil. Don't do like this guy is doing. Just calls the guy evil. Beloved, I think the word actually there is children in the Greek. So though it's a personal letter to Gaius, he is clearly addressing the whole congregation. Beloved. Gaius is the guy who's going to carry this letter now to the church. And in a congregation that's that highly charged with negativity, again, imagine the effect of bringing a letter in like this and reading it with that Diotrephes guy sitting right there giving you the stink eye the whole time. Imagine the explosion that would cause in a congregation to call this guy out by name and call him evil in front of everybody. Well, a guy who's working that hard to protect himself and be first in the church. Man, this would have been a nuclear explosion in this congregation, but a necessary one. Peace is not the God of the congregation. Sometimes the God of truth makes a war happen in order to bring a greater peace. And this is an example of it.
Do you think that maybe he had some followers also?
Oh, no doubt. Yeah, no doubt. He was feeding off of the praise of some little group in the congregation that was telling him how great he was and that he was justified doing it. He wouldn't have been doing it if he wasn't feeding off of somebody. Yeah. Meanwhile, the sheep suffer. A couple of minutes, verse 12. Demetrius has a good testimony from all and from the truth itself, and we also bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true. Now, this Demetrius guy, all of a sudden, boom, who's this guy? A most commentators seem to think this is the guy who carries the letter from John to Gaius. So John sends somebody that the congregation would know and trust and like to carry this letter directly from John to Gaius. So that when this letter is read, this Demetrius guy is standing right there as John's spokesman. John can't be there, but Demetrius is John, as far as the congregation is concerned. He speaks for John. So John gives him this high praise because it's going to be these two guys, Gaius and Demetrius, who are going to stand in front of the congregation and deliver that letter. So he has a good testimony. Listen to him. He's in the truth itself. The scriptures bear witness to the guy's faithfulness. And you know that I'm speaking the truth to you. And then 13 and 14, the conclusion, I have many things to write. I don't wish to write to you with pen and ink. I hope to see you shortly, and we'll speak face to face. Now, is that law or gospel? I hope to see you shortly, and we'll speak face to face. It depends who you are. If you're Diotrephes, that's law. You hear your kid is in a bunch of trouble and messing everything up, and you call him up and you say, look, I'm not going to talk to you this over the phone. We're going to talk face to face. That's the law. That's terror. But if you're one of the abused sheep who's getting kicked to the curb constantly, and you hear John's going to show up and deal with this is great news. John's going to come. He'll set this stuff straight. So if you would take comfort in that, but clearly this is more than friendship being applied that we'll speak face to face. This is, I'm going to deal with this personally, but until then, you've got this letter to deal with it. And then he prefaces all this in love, goes on for 8 verses about love and truth, and then he ends it, peace to you. Our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name. It's a sandwich of love with this horrible problem that he's dealing with in the middle. It's a study. It's a study in how to deal with a problem. It really is. He is firm as can be, but he's so nice about it. And he calls out the sin for what it is, just plain calls it evil. But his eye isn't on any hostility. His eye isn't on anger. His eye is always towards, this is for the overall good. This is for the peace of the flock. This is to restore truth and love. This is for the sake of the gospel we're doing this. And it's an excellent lesson for how to deal with conflict. And one would assume that it worked, but we don't have a 4th John to tell us what became of this when this letter was read in public. So that pretty much explodes the notion of a golden age of Christianity when everybody was happy. Even these early churches had tremendous conflict, but it was conflict that wasn't allowed to fester. It was dealt with. It was dealt with in love, in truth, and yet firmness. So, any questions or comments? All right, let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the truth that you have given us and pray that you might make love grow among us through the preaching of Christ and the eternal life and grace given us through him. Prevent evil from taking root among us and causing division, and bless us forever in your truth for Jesus' sake.